Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this webinar on nature-based solutions to global challenges, the goal of which is to provide something of an overview, a bit of insight into what nature-based solutions are and their potential, and a glimpse into the 8-week online foundation course we are running later this month and again in January 2023. So this course has been developed in close partnership with the Smith School, so between the Smith School and the School of Geography and the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative in the Department of Biology, both at the University of Oxford. So before I go on, I need to tell you that this webinar is being recorded so that others that weren't able to join today are able to watch it later. I also want to, at this point, say that we do really welcome your questions. Please put those in the Q&A chat function on this Zoom call, and we will do our best to address those questions at the end of the interventions by the different panelists. We might not have time to address them all, but we will do our best. And thanks to those of you who have already submitted questions for this. So as you will be aware, nature-based solutions have gained much traction in business and policy over the last 2 years, but there's confusion about what counts as a nature-based solution and how they should be designed and implemented, financed and governed and so forth. So to address this, we're running this foundation course, and our aim is to improve awareness and understanding of the scientific basis, the knowledge from practice, policy, the financing and governance, so forth, of the nature-based solutions among current and future public servants and executives, leaders, and others from the private sector and, of course, from civil society. So in this course, there are 8 critical themes delivered across 8 weeks with 2 2-hour sessions each Tuesday of each week, and lectures and workshops each week will be delivered by world-leading experts, 3 of which join me today for a panel discussion about the role of nature-based solutions to address global challenges. So before going any further into this webinar, let me introduce myself and the others. So if the others could put their videos on, that would be fantastic. Thank you. So I am Natalie Seddon. I'm Professor of Biodiversity in the Department of Biology at the University of Oxford. I'm also Founding Director of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative. And I am joined today by Cecile Girardin, Kaya Axelson and Nicola Ranger. Cecile is Technical Director of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative and Founding Director of the Oxford University social venture, Nature-Based Insetting. Welcome, Cecile. Kaya is Net Zero Policy Engagement Fellow at the Oxford Net Zero Initiative at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford also. And Nicola is Deputy Director of the UK Centre for Greening Finance and Investment and Head of Sustainable Finance Research for Development in the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group. Welcome, Nicola. Welcome, Kaya. Thank you all for very much for joining us today. So in this webinar, what we're going to do is start with me talking a little bit about a broad overview of nature-based solutions. And then I'm going to turn to our panelists to ask them some critical questions in the field of nature-based solutions, and also give them an opportunity to talk a little bit more about the sorts of things they're going to be tackling in much greater depth during the foundation course itself. So first of all, I guess some basics. Nature-based solutions are ways of working with and enhancing nature to address societal goals, whether those goals are tackling climate change, addressing poverty, biodiversity loss, whatever it might be. And these actions, broadly speaking, involve protection and restoration of natural and semi-natural ecosystems, both on land and also in the sea, in our coastal and our marine environments, involves a sustainable management of our working lands and our seas, our aquatic systems, and the creation of novel ecosystems. In particular, I mean bringing green and blue, so water-based as well as green infrastructure into our cities, into our urban and our peri-urban environments. Now, the concept of a nature-based solution has emerged against a backdrop of lots of really dismal news about the state of the climate and the biosphere, and the fact that our failure to address either is increasing inequality across the world and increasing poverty. And it emerges as we recognize that many of the challenges we face are really interlinked. They share many of the same drivers, and they need really coherent joined up, integrated solutions, of which nature-based solutions are one such approach that can work alongside behavioral solutions and also technological solutions. The concept of a nature-based solution is also sort of grounded in or emerges from the really robust scientific knowledge that healthy, biodiverse, species-rich connected ecosystems produce a diverse range of benefits, multiple benefits for humans, or otherwise called ecosystem services, on which human health, wealth, and well-being depends all over the world. But of course, the extent to which nature brings these benefits really depends on, relies on how we implement them, how we finance them, how we invest them, how we monitor and evaluate them over time. So there's lots of really important nuance about really supporting and tending the natural world and thereby enabling it to continue to be what is in effect our life support system. So the concept of a nature-based solution with its holistic benefits recognizes nature, that we are part of nature and that nature is our life support system. So the ultimate goal of any nature-based solution or an intervention in this context in the natural world is to support sustainable development. And the ecosystems themselves, therefore, must be very healthy and functional and biodiverse if these benefits are to be provided in the long term. We don't get any benefits from nature unless nature is itself healthy. So to qualify as a nature-based solution, any action, any intervention, whether it's management, restoration, creation, must sustainably provide one or more benefits for people whilst also supporting or enhancing ecosystem health compared to what was going on in that landscape or seascape prior to the intervention. So enhancing biodiversity as a component, a critical component of ecosystem health. So what we've found is, as evidence for the important role nature-based solutions, or for the potential role of nature-based solutions in addressing societal challenges, perhaps especially their role in addressing the climate crisis. So there's been a real sort of uptick in global traction, really real interest, increase in interest across research, practice, the business community, the governments of the world. And so here we just see that, a large number of the world's countries have now included nature-based solutions in their climate pledges associated with the Paris Agreement. In fact, over 90% of Paris agreements have committed at least to implementing nature-based solutions for climate change. We see here that the term climate change being used increasingly in scientific studies, around the exponential growth in references to the term nature-based solutions in peer-reviewed studies. We have, lots of government interests. I'm not going to read out this slide. You can look at it now or perhaps later, but there's been a huge increase in the number of pledges. And particularly we saw that in COP26 in Glasgow late last year, it was nature-based solutions were a major theme. And many pledges, for example, the Glasgow Leaders Declaration for Forest and Land Use, where now over 143 countries have committed to working collectively to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation. So basically committing to some core nature-based solutions by 2030. And many of you, perhaps are from the private sector, you'll be aware there's this growing recognition, that growing interest in investing in nature-based solutions to reduce risk, and growing recognition that the cost of not doing something about our damage to the natural world is far exceeding the cost of doing something about it. And we know from analyses by various bodies, including, but not restricted to, the World Economic Forum, that showing that businesses really depend on nature, and that actually a huge amount of economic value generation comes through our relationship with the natural world. We've got the Business for Nature Coalition, the Capitals Coalition, dozens of funding pledges from major corporations. We've got initiatives which Cecile and others will talk about later, like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. But what counts? How can they best be designed? How can nature-based solutions best be designed, implemented, financed, and governed so as to sustainably, ethically deliver multiple benefits for people now and into the future? So that's what we're going to get into in the foundation course. But what I want to first of all start now provides opportunity for my extremely knowledgeable panel to contribute to this discussion and really sort of give a bit of a high level overview of some of those benefits of working with the natural world. First of all, I want to talk about the evidence that nature-based solutions can address climate change impacts in particular. So in other words, focusing on the role of nature-based solutions for dealing with those effects of climate change on the economy and on communities. So if I can turn to you first of all, Nicola, I mean, what is the evidence that working with nature can help us deal with the impacts of climate change and help us build much needed resilience in a warming world?
Thank you so much, Natalie, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for the invitation, and also a pleasure to be part of the upcoming course from the Sustainable Finance Group at Oxford. So the evidence on adaptation to climate change, so I think first let's note that, as you said, Natalie, that nature is a key life support system. So before we start thinking about how nature-based solutions can help adaptation, and one thing we need to recognize is that the continued loss of nature biodiversity can actually be a massive aggravating impact on climate change as well. So it's a double whammy that we would get from climate change, but also from damage to nature and from loss of biodiversity. And the reason for that is that, as you've outlined, ecosystems, nature more broadly, biodiversity are absolutely integral to many of the different support systems that we need for our economy to function, for our health, for our livelihoods. For example, in terms of water quality, in terms of flood protection, in terms of pollinators for agriculture, for example. So all of these sectors that will be impacted by climate change, all of these areas, so for example, rising flood risk from climate change is what we expect in the future, impacts on crop productivity in different parts of the world. All of these will be aggravated if we do not address the damage to ecosystems that we're seeing at the moment. So I think that was the first point that I wanted to make. The second point then is, so how can investing in supporting nature-based solutions or putting in place policies to support nature-based solutions, how can that help us adapt in addition to through protecting nature as I laid out? So it's in these key areas that I just outlined. So for example, flood protection. A really good example of that is looking at green coastal infrastructure. So there we can show very, very clearly that the costs of investing in nature-based solutions, so green infrastructure, are well outweighed by the benefits of doing that, and are far higher than, in many cases, or in some cases, than the benefits of investing in engineering solutions. So actually, when we as academics and as policymakers and practitioners start looking at adaptation solutions, it's absolutely critical that we look at the nature-based solutions alongside other types of solutions, because they can deliver significant benefits for adaptation as well as for many other benefits as well. The other example that I wanted to give is in the area of heat, which we've all been thinking a lot about over this summer, both in the UK and around the world. And actually, I was just looking up the statistics of the number of people that died very sadly across Europe. And it's in the tens of thousands. And one of the big challenges and related to heat is in urban settings. And here we have brilliant examples of the benefits of nature-based solutions in urban settings in terms of reducing heat wave fatalities. One example being, at the moment in Milan, they're actually investing in 3 million trees being planted by 2030. And they estimate that will actually reduce the temperature in Milan in the summer by about 2 degrees. So, largely offsetting some of the temperature changes that you'd expect over that period. So nature-based solutions are an incredibly important part of adaptation, and also an incredibly cost-effective part of adaptation.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Nicola. So, that's some evidence for nature's role in helping us deal with the impacts of climate change, many of which are actually locked into the system, whatever we do on mitigation. But we want to know a little bit more about what's its role in slowing that warming. I mean, we hear a lot, especially there's been a lot of coverage of this in recent times, the potential of working with nature and implementing nature-based solutions to help cool the planet. So Cecile, let me turn to you to ask, what's the state of the evidence for nature's role, particularly nature-based solutions' role in mitigating or in slowing warming in general, and perhaps in meeting net zero commitments specifically? I mean, we hear lots of bold claims being made about the potential of nature in addressing climate change mitigation, but are these supported by the scientific evidence? I'll just share my screen again now so that your slide is up.
Thanks, Natalie. And yeah, I'm very excited, as Nicola said, excited to participate in the course over the next few weeks. So as Nicola said, nature-based solutions provide this multitude of benefits that are essential for our life support, for our society, water, nutrients, crop productivity, resilience of ecological and social systems. But as you point out, Natalie, the potential contribution of nature-based solutions to climate mitigation still remains controversial. And as companies and countries are turning towards nature-based solutions to respond to climate change, having set ambitious target or in the process of setting ambitious targets, we need to know what role and nature-based solutions have in this, this race to net zero. So until now, well, a lot of the analysis you're talking about, Natalie, focuses on how much carbon they can remove from the atmosphere. And we need to translate this into how much avoided warming we're achieving by implementing nature-based solutions at scale. And so with this in mind, we set out to answer the question in a context that's relevant to the Paris Agreement. So how much can nature-based solutions contribute to limiting peak warming to well below 2 degrees C this century, whilst pursuing efforts to limiting to 1.5 degrees C? And to do that, we provide the latest estimates. So this is an updated model from Griscom et al. 2017 model that looks at how much the different pathways for nature-based solutions contribute to mitigating climate change. And it's important to note that this scenario, we go to this model in particular because it only considers projects for nature-based solutions that are constrained by many factors. So these are cost-effective projects that cost less than $100 US dollars per ton of CO2 equivalents, already very high cost, but that's what we're looking at here. They ensure adequate global production of food and wood-based products. They ensure biodiversity conservation, and then respect land tenure rights and consider the albedo effect, etc. So it's important to consider all these constraints when we're looking at these models. And all in all, we get to an estimate that nature-based solutions could save approximately 10 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year, which could be considered as the equivalent of maybe the transport sector or the agricultural sector emissions annually, but not transport plus agriculture plus construction plus everything. So we need to put this in perspective of how much they can achieve in terms of, and I know Kaya later on will talk about offsets, but with this, bear this in mind. So half of this comes from avoiding emissions, 5 gigatons CO2 per year. And these avoided emissions come from protecting lands, intact lands, all ecosystems, forest, grassland, savanna, peatlands. We need to consider all ecosystems here. And from managing, better management of working lands. So I just saw the question here. It's tons of CO2 equivalent, megagram CO2 is a ton of CO2 equivalent. There's just a question that popped up. So working lands, so here we're looking at sustainable management, regenerative agriculture, what we're calling it these days, but the sustainable management of land with climate mitigation in mind. So for example, increasing carbon content of soils, low tillage, etc. And then when we're the other half of this, 10 of these 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year come from enhancing sinks. So that's where we're drawing carbon out of the atmosphere. And that consists mainly of better management of land plus restoration. So you can see here that 20% of the total comes from restoring all ecosystems, not just tree planting, restoring forests, wetlands, grasslands, etc. Mangroves. So we talk about all this in the course in more detail, of course, but for now, I'll just go to the next slide. And we just consider also how much land do we need to achieve these targets. This is important to bear in mind because we have a finite amount of land on this planet. And we need to ensure food security, wood product security, fiber security, etc., land tenure rights, as well as mitigating greenhouse gas through nature-based solutions. 40% of this comes from protecting existing lands. We don't need more land for this. Then another 40% comes from managing. Also, they're already being used for agricultural land, so we don't need more land for this. And the 20% that comes from restoring lands would require 678 million hectares to be restored. That's about the equivalent of twice the size of India. So next slide, please. Then we look at how this actually impacts our target in terms of peak warming. So we put these, the results of that model that I just showed you before into the Ipcc projections. So you can see the figure on the right here shows the Ipcc projections. The straight lines, the solid lines, show Ipcc projections without adding our nature-based solutions mitigation scenario. And the dashed lines show the same scenario, scenario, but when we're adding the nature-based solutions mitigation. So you can see that in a scenario, the turquoise colored one, in a scenario where we're peaking at 1.5 degree, so by mid-century, we reach our peak global warming at 1.5 degree and then go down. The deploying nature-based solutions on a large scale starting immediately would reduce our emissions, would reduce our global warming by 0.1 degree C. And then later on, you can see that as you continue down further into the century, they continue cooling our planet. So they have an important effect in cooling our planet, and they continue acting as long as we're investing in the right types of nature-based solutions, in solutions that are ecologically sound, socially sound, then they will continue acting and cooling our planet. And in a scenario where we're peaking at 2 degrees, they reduce up to 0.3 degrees C in warming. So I hope this puts it in a context that's relevant to the Paris Agreement, and we'll be discussing this more during the course.
Thanks very much, Cecile. That's very clear. And actually, one of the questions that popped up was about the temperature scale and how we can relate nature-based solutions to global temperature. So that was, I think, answered the question as you delivered that. So it's clear. The science is very clear, isn't it? That nature-based solution can play an important role in climate change mitigation this century, but it can only do this in tandem with really rapid decarbonisation, with keeping the fossil fuels in the ground. Because unless we do, the result of warming is just going to turn the biosphere, turn all these important ecosystems into net sources of greenhouse gases. And the problem, of course, is that many governments, many companies are investing or saying that they will invest in what they're calling, so-called nature-based solutions programs, without also providing any evidence really that they're radically scaling back fossil fuel use across all their operations. In other words, there is evidence that many are actually using nature-based solutions in greenwashing, which is hugely problematic, and we really need to tackle this. So Kaya, sort of over to you now, I think. I mean, how do we ensure the nature-based solutions are not used in greenwashing, and what standards and mechanisms are in place or are being developed at the moment that can really help tackle this critical issue?
Thanks so much, Natalie. This is such a huge issue. This is what we call the integrity gap, and Oxford Net Zero, in partnership with the New Climate Institute, tracks net zero targets, including kind of the qualitative robustness under those targets. So whether they have interim targets, whether they have a robust plan, whether their reporting is credible. But one of the major issues where we see an integrity gap is in the use of offsets. And particularly, we're looking for quite a lot more clarity from companies on how they plan to use offsets. So as Natalie has just mentioned, particularly there could be inappropriate uses of offsets, specifically nature-based solutions that that might be quite cheap on the market, that have low governance, low assurance of the storage permanence. Those might be being used to offset long-term fossil carbon emissions and kind of legitimize continued use of carbon emissions or of emissions in general. So I think it's important to just start with the facts to acknowledge that we do have an integrity gap. So our tracker here shows you that across companies with net zero targets in the Forbes 2000 list that we look at, the largest companies in the world, you can see the use of offsets is largely not specified. So we're looking for companies to develop policies, but we also are looking for particular things within those policies, like is that offsetting net zero aligned? And I can explain a bit what that would mean. So if we go to the next graph, sorry, not the next graph, but the next slide, Oxford Net Zero, very early in the kind of offsetting debate, the offsetting market has had a spike. And so people have been using carbon credits, the voluntary carbon market, which I have to acknowledge are not all based on nature-based solutions. In fact, it would be good if there was more kind of stringency on adherence to the nature-based solution principles across the voluntary carbon market. But the carbon market is full of what we would call avoided emissions offsets. So things like efficient cook stoves that help people with their emissions from cooking. And that also has kind of the co-benefit of black carbon reduction. They might be proforestation, it might be afforestation. There's a whole range of different types of carbon projects in the voluntary carbon market. And in 2010, there was a crisis in that market where there was sort of a boom and a bust. There was an integrity crisis where there were too many scandals, there was too many unverified projects that people stopped investing as much. And then with the advent of quite a lot of activism and net zero really became a popular frame, especially after the Paris Agreement. I saw an article that showed that there was a Greta Tunberg effect. The youth movement really raised the profile of the need to take climate action. And as a result, there was actually, well, possibly as a result, but kind of correlation, there was a fourfold increase in investment in the voluntary carbon market. So that was really interesting. That showed people really wanted to do something. They wanted to put their money towards good. But as Greta has pointed out herself, as has many journalists and academics, not all investment is good investment, and not all investment is net zero aligned investment. So the net zero frame is an interesting one because it implies that you are actually saying that when you are continuing to emit, you are balancing those emissions with a removal and storage. But a lot of the voluntary carbon market is actually not based on removals at all. It's based on, what I've just said around avoided emissions. And we think that those types of projects are incredibly worthy, important projects, but they may not be appropriate at the net zero target date if you're going to be claiming that you have a balance. And so one of the principles that we set out in these net zero aligned offsetting principles, again, I want to clarify, these are not offsetting principles for just how you might invest in credits. They're not principles for how you might invest in projects that you think are worthy for other reasons. But if you were to make a net zero claim, we think that these should be based on removals. So over time in particular, perhaps you are offsetting towards a carbon neutrality claim, or you're just investing in carbon credits because you feel that that's an important thing to do, because as we've learned, we need to inject quite a lot of investment in both adaptation and nature in the short term. So you might be doing that anyway, but over time, you need to be ensuring that by the kind of net zero target date, if you're making a net zero claim, that is being balanced by removals. So that's principle 2 there that you see in the Oxford offsetting principles. And then there's also an issue of time balance. So when you emit, especially fossil carbon, it has a really long lifespan in the atmosphere. Methane is quite a potent greenhouse gas, but it doesn't have as long of a forcing element in the atmosphere. So you don't have to worry about it for quite as long. So there's different greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But if you're investing in nature-based solutions, or if you're investing in geological storage, you need to be thinking about the kind of long-term permanence of that removal. You need to be thinking, is it kind of going to balance out those emissions? Because if you think about net zero, it shouldn't be just a single point in time, right? It's something that you want to sustain. Otherwise, what's the point? Are future generations, or over the next kind of generation of kind of corporate leaders, are they going to have to just re-up the removal and storage that you invested in because it was a very short term, perhaps because of shifting land use practices, perhaps because of poor governance? If the removal and storage goes away, the net zero balance goes away. So shifting towards long-lived removal is another principle of net zero aligned offsetting. And then, you know, something that has also kind of proliferated as these principles have kind of been considered as part of a lot of new standards. And so what we're seeing is that companies were, as I said, they hadn't specified their offsetting policies. And partly that was because they were waiting for some of these standards like the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative and the ICVCM, which are similarly named, to kind of put out some principles. So these are just a few principles, but the final principle here is that you need to support the long-term development of these removal approaches. So if you think about an ecosystem and you invest in it now to allow it to start restoring, you want to, you know, give it time so that over years that investment will pay dividends and the removals will be there over the long term. But it needs time to grow sometimes, just like the technological removals need time to approach down the experience curve and scale in terms of what they can do as for their removal capacity. So there are, as I mentioned, a lot more principles on offsetting. You wouldn't want to just pay attention to ours that we came up with around net zero aligned offsetting. The nature-based solution principles, which the team, I'm sure, can send to everyone in the chat, those outline really important, like, core aspects of what could be considered a nature-based solution. In particular, there's a lot of evidence that shows that accordance with and involvement of Indigenous communities and local communities is one of the most surefire ways to ensure that removal, that nature-based project is sustainable and long-term. If you don't include local communities, you can imagine how that kind of project could get reversed or abandoned. And in particular, a lot of those local communities and Indigenous communities have a lot of knowledge, have the best knowledge of how to be stewards of that land. So that's one of the nature-based solution principles I wanted to highlight. Then I mentioned these two in the middle, the very similarly named standards that are emerging right now. They're under consultation right now to really improve the integrity of the voluntary carbon market. If we think about what happened, as I said, in the early 2000s, where there was a boom and bust in the voluntary carbon market, we can think about how we're in a real risky place with the voluntary carbon market, where there's all this money that needs to go into these great projects. But if we have an integrity crisis, that money could dry up again. And so the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative is a standard that is being developed it's an initiative that's being developed for the buyer's side. So those are mostly for the companies or even individual actors who might be wanting to claim different things based on offsets or credits. And the ICVCM, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, is thinking about the sellers. So the producers of those projects, the registries, all of the middlemen that go into the voluntary carbon market, and how to make sure that they're doing the right thing so that we have additionality, so that we don't have double counting, so that we have permanence, to ensure that there's strong social integrity and there's adaptation funding. And a really cool initiative that I've just started to support based on some Oxford professors are advancing this idea that a share of proceeds from those registries, from the voluntary carbon market, should actually go directly into the Paris Adaptation Fund. Because regardless of what happens at the level of those projects, we should probably be investing more in adaptation. And if this is a market that's making money off the backs of, let's be honest, like mostly developing communities, and particularly for nature-based solutions, there's a lot in the global south, we should also be putting some of that money back into those communities. So that's called SOPA, share of proceeds for adaptation. And then I'm going to talk about the two kind of final ones I put here. Carbon Direct is a think tank that has some, I think, really good principles for high quality NBCS, and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Now, I know this is quite a lot of principles, standards, but I think that it's really important that we pay attention to the emerging landscape here as it keeps up with science and best practice and feedback from communities that are on the ground developing these projects.
Thanks so much, Kaya. That was a brilliant, concise overview of a very complex and ever-evolving field. And I think the work you're doing in trying to keep on top of this and aligning these and making sure everything's, evidence-based and ethical is, can't underestimate the importance of that. So thank you for sharing that. And in fact, quite a few questions inevitably came up as you were speaking. So hopefully we'll have time to address some of them. But if you did feel you had capacity at the moment to address some of them over the next few moments as well, Kaya, maybe there's a couple there that you could answer as we move on. So I would say it is clear from the scientific evidence and from the evidence from practitioners as well that we can't meet those big mitigation and adaptation goals, nor I would argue our biodiversity or nature positive pledges without nature-based solutions, so long as we do that in tandem with decarbonisation. But we've also discussed and heard more about that just now, that many challenges remain, but there are this sort of emerging sort of ecosystem of standards and guidelines that will help ensure that nature-based solutions are not used in greenwashing and do good work in the world and in stabilising the climate. And a critical issue, of course, is whether investment in nature-based solutions makes economic sense and whether we can finance in an ethical and sustainable way the upscaling of nature-based solutions globally so that they can help us meet all these challenges. So I want to turn back to you now, Nicola. First of all, could you tell us a little bit something about the wider economics of nature-based solutions and why it's becoming increasingly important actually to think about this in terms of financial stability and perhaps also drawing from your own sort of direct area of expertise, what are the opportunities that are to bring more financing into nature-based solutions for adaptation and resilience? And what role does the central banks have and what role does financial supervision regulation play in catalysing more finance for nature recovery and nature-based solutions specifically? So yeah, over to you if you can tackle those really quite essential topics. That would be great to hear from you.
Excuse me, I lost my voice. Thank you very much. And yeah, so let me try and address those points and also hopefully convince the audience of why banks and central banks are even relevant in this discussion, which I think to some people is an open question. But let's jump into it then in terms of, so what do we actually know about the economic benefits of protecting nature? So I've got a couple of examples here from some recent work. One study both studies by the World Bank, one in collaboration with the academic Justin Johnson and the other one with the central bank in Malaysia. Now the first one here, so this on the left-hand side, is showing you the potential loss of GDP from a partial ecosystem collapse scenario. So what that actually means is it's looking at for only 4 different types of ecosystem services, which include pollination, loss of fisheries, loss of timber, and I forgot the 4th one actually. I think that perhaps it's only 3, which was and it shows just for those areas of ecosystem collapse. So a 90% loss of those ecosystem services, what's the impact on GDP for different countries? And you can see here that for some countries actually up to about 20% of GDP lost, particularly for those countries that are heavily dependent on sectors related to ecosystems, so agriculture, fisheries, forestry. Overall, it's still a couple of percentage points of GDP. So these are very, very large impacts on GDP at a national scale, particularly for developing countries, but actually for all countries. And I think the important thing to say, though, is that we know that all of these estimates are very much underestimates. As I say, it's only looking at certain ecosystems here. It's not looking at the whole picture. And it's not looking at all of the complex interdependencies between those systems. So what we know, and I was actually spent some time with central banks last week talking about this issue and trying to look at how can we actually bring the extent of this impact of nature actually into our financial decision making. And one of the challenges is that actually, we all know that actually if you lose nature, you lose most of GDP. Our economy cannot function without nature. So there's a lot of interesting questions that we'll actually talk about in the course around how you can bring the economics of nature more into financial decision making. And why is finance so important in this? So finance is so important because the global financial system really shapes the structure of our economy. So the decisions that are made by banks, by insurers, by investors, direct financial flows into areas of economic activity that can either be damaging for nature or supportive of nature. And if we don't ensure that those financial decisions are taking account of nature and climate change, it means that finance can flow into areas that is damaging for nature. And that's the key thing. That's why we really need to care about what banks and central banks are thinking about this, and why we really need to care that we're actually properly costing and valuing these impacts and properly bringing it into financial decision making. Another example I have here from Malaysia, and there's actually been a number of economies around the world that have done these analyses now, but I've picked this one from Malaysia because it's one of the most recent ones. And they showed, so they looked at different types of financial institutions. So you can see so we're looking now at the figure on the right-hand side, commercial banks, other types of banks, so the big yellow being the commercial banks, and how the lending from those banks flows through to different areas of the economy, and then how they are dependent on different ecosystem services. And the key ecosystem services that they're dependent on are actually ones that are not included in the figure on the left-hand side. So the impacts on water systems, the impacts on flooding, those benefits are not included in a lot of our economic estimates. And what they found in Malaysia was that about 50% of all activities that are being financed by the banks are fully dependent on nature. And this isn't unique to Malaysia. Obviously, Malaysia is a very biodiversity rich country, but it happens in Europe as well. So a similar analysis was done by the Dutch central bank a couple of years ago. One of the first analyses like this was done that showed that actually 36% of bank portfolios in the Netherlands are either highly or very highly dependent on ecosystem services. So this is a huge potential risk faced by the financial sector, and therefore a big financial stability risk from loss of ecosystems, but actually then is a big driver for starting to value and price these risks into financial decision making. And that is if that can happen, it can really change financial flows. If you go to the next slide, please, to give some examples of this. So when we think about this area, we think about it from two different lenses, and this is what we'll talk about in the course. So financing green and greening finance. So financing green is about mobilizing more finance, so different types of financial instruments, payment for ecosystem services, for example, actually into nature-based solutions. Whereas greening finance is about making nature a key part of every financial decision in the economy. And both are really equally important. And I would say, when we're talking about how we can scale up financing, we often think about the financing green part. So we've been talking about the role of carbon markets there, which itself, it's estimated to be a source of about $800 billion in financing for nature-based solutions, potentially. But that is potentially dwarfed if we can get every financial decision in the economy actually accounting for nature. It's much, much, much larger. So this is a key thing that we need to focus on. How do we make both of these sides work? And there's a huge amount happening on both aspects. Just to mention a couple. So on the greening finance, we see the task force for nature-based financial disclosures is absolutely critical there. So this is an ongoing initiative, is releasing beta versions at the moment of disclosure metrics. And a number of financial institutions are already committing to disclosing the impact of their investments on nature and the risks that they face related to nature. And again, can be a really big driver of change. And then on the financing green side, I think one thing that we need to recognize is that a lot of that finance is actually now coming from the public sector. So about 86% of finance for nature-based solutions is coming from the public sector. And clearly we need to really scale up the private sector finance, but to do that, you really need the public sector to act in various ways to make markets for investment in nature. And that's something that we'll talk about on the course as well. But there are a number of really exciting things happening on the financing green as well. For example, new types of sustainability linked financial products that actually give corporates an interest rate cut if they invest more in nature, for example. So there's a huge amount of innovation and lots of opportunity in this area right now.
Thanks so much, Nicola. We're really rich again, and lots more that we will have the opportunity to go into in more detail in the course. But obviously this is a very rapidly evolving landscape, isn't it? And it's some really, really important to stay really engaged with this and really think about those innovative forms of finance, blended forms of finance, and also to ensure that the right sort of finance gets to the right sorts of communities and projects that they're running, to keep the integrity there on the ground. So I wanted to turn now to you, Cecile, and ask you, private companies are increasingly realizing the urgent need to quantify and address their impacts on biodiversity for all sorts of reasons, as well as to decarbonize their operations up to scope 3. And I wonder whether you could reflect or share your thoughts on what's driving this.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. So yes, as you say, a number of global announcements that affect businesses have been made, especially in particular in 2021. A lot happened, as Nicola and Kaya have mentioned. For example, the G7 backed the introduction of the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure reporting requirements that Nicola was just discussing. So on top of the climate-related financial disclosure reporting requirements, which are already well advanced, we now have the nature-related financial disclosure requirements. And these were established to provide risk management and disclosure framework for organizations to report and act on nature-related risks and opportunities. And as Nicola said, the aim of this whole thing is to shift financial flows away from negative outcomes for climate, nature, and inequality. There's also more recently announced inequality piece, the TIFD, TCFD, TNFD, TIFD. It's the alphabet soup everyone's talking about at the moment. And we also add to this the science-based targets to nature, SBTN, and many other consortiums that are trying to find synergy between methodologies and approach and frameworks that companies are using. So from 2023, companies will need to disclose their nature-related impacts alongside the climate-related metrics they've been disclosing since 2015. And incidentally, this is now mandatory in the UK. So large companies and financial institutions need to disclose their climate-related financial disclosure. And all these initiatives are regulated by the International Sustainability Standards Board that was established at COP26. This is what the slide here is, a mural I painted with colleagues during COP26 to illustrate that a lot was happening in the core business of the negotiations. So in the center of the circle here, you can see all the negotiations that were done for the core business of the negotiations, which were the conclusion of the Paris Rulebook to operationalize the Paris Agreement and the text of the Glasgow Climate Pact. But a lot of the discussions happened around the negotiations. And we saw a flurry of announcements, and in particular, big nature-related announcements that were happening. So these are represented all around the circle. And so there was a strong focus on halting deforestation and shifting to more sustainable farming practices. For example, you already mentioned, Natalie, the Glasgow Leaders Forest Declaration, which includes more than 100 countries now, and that account for more than 90% of the world's forests. And most notably Brazil, Colombia, Indonesia, and Democratic Republic of Congo that commit to end deforestation by 2030. And then there was a financial sector roadmap for eliminating commodity-driven deforestation. So again, a very strong focus on avoiding land degradation and deforestation and the conversion of natural ecosystems. So all in all, these commitments from the public and private sector amounted to approximately 19 billion for nature and land use. And these include very location-specific commitments, such as the joint statement to support the Congo Forest Basin, that recognize in particular the importance of the peatlands sheltered in the Congo Basin, to more general global statements like the Forest, Agriculture and Commodities Trade Statement. So there's this flurry of announcements that demonstrate that the private sector are increasingly engaged in supporting biodiversity as well as addressing climate change. And in recognition of this, also the World Economic Forum ranks biodiversity and biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis in the top 4 biggest risks to our global economy. So all these commitments are great, important, given the need for the private sector to finance, to achieve our global goals for climate and biodiversity. But now we are lagging behind in terms of providing the mechanisms to ensure the accountability, the transparency of this. How will these commitments be implemented, monitored, regulated, and all this in a socially just context? So one of my favorite quotes from COP was that we need a just transition, not just a transition. And so just to add, I just wanted to add also that we've seen a lot of similar announcements in the past, and a lot of people are asking what's different now, why would things be different now? And the consensus, and maybe that's also a question for Kaya and Nicola, but what I've heard is that now there's more money on the table, there's more pressure from civil society to hold governments and businesses into account. There's also a clear understanding of the risks and opportunities associated with climate change and biodiversity loss, and a wealth of evidence that shows that investing in biodiversity makes economic sense. And companies are ready to engage because they've been preparing, well, in terms of biodiversity, they've been preparing for all this on the climate change and greenhouse gas mitigation side. And it won't take long for the voluntary reporting to become mandatory reporting when we're talking about biodiversity.
Yeah, so thanks very much for that overview, Cecile. I mean, you work with private companies to demonstrate that the concept of insetting could go far beyond compensating for greenhouse gas emissions along supply chains. Could you quite briefly share some of your insights on this, and then hopefully we'll have just a few minutes at the end to turn to some of the critical questions that our audience have raised. So could be really reasonably concise.
Okay, thanks. I'll try to be concise because I know we're running out on time. So but I find the work that we're doing with companies very encouraging, and we'll be going into this in more detail during the executive education. But we've set up a social venture called Nature-Based Insetting. It's a spin out of Oxford University Innovations, and we work at the interface of research and practice to help companies understand, quantify and mitigate their impacts, their risks, their dependencies on biodiversity specifically, and also we're really looking at climate. And in doing so, we're demonstrating in practical terms that companies can improve the resilience of the natural capital assets they're depending on. So for example, at the moment, we're working with a multinational that has hundreds of complex supply chains, and we're piloting an approach that allows them to set and achieve evidence-based goals for biodiversity and climate for each supply chain, whilst understanding the social context they're operating in. So to do this, we've developed an analytical framework that's supported by a model, and the model aims to inform decision-making at a landscape scale. So it's a quantitative model and a spatially explicit land model. Maybe if you go to the next slide, I can show a little bit of the work we're doing to illustrate. So for example, we're looking at a commodity landscape. and the farms that we're looking at are more or less in the center of this landscape. But we're looking at zooming out onto the whole landscape to include watershed area, water basins, and protected areas. And apologize, the text is way too small. I'll fix this for when we talk about it again. But on the top left, we have greenhouse gas flux of the landscape. So you can see that the beige areas are protected areas and do not emit any greenhouse gas, whereas the agricultural lands are dark brown and emit a lot of greenhouse gas, as expected. The big figure on the right shows the biodiversity impact metric. So that's the aggregated terrestrial biodiversity impact metrics that composed of different factors like land use change, nitrification rates, fragmentation, etc. So we include all these factors to estimate the impact at the landscape scale and the different pressures that this landscape is experiencing. So you can see very clearly that the roads have a very high impact, biodiversity impact, so low biodiversity, and the protected areas, which are in pale brown beige, have higher biodiversity basically. So then in the bottom left, you can see the impact of biodiversity on rivers. And if you look at the river system, you can clearly see here that the protected areas show less impact on biodiversity in rivers, and that these rivers coming out of the protected areas have higher biodiversity. And these feed into the agricultural lands that are at the center of the landscape. So you're really starting to build a picture here on what you can do to help improve the water management, the water quality and regulation, and will help improve the way agricultural lands work and function, basically the whole landscape, ecological resilience of the landscape. And I won't go into too much detail, but on the bottom right here, you can see the converted wetlands. So all the areas in brown, dark brown, are wetlands that should have been there, but that have been converted to agricultural lands. And if you can really squint and see, the areas in blue are wetlands that have not been converted and are still intact. So you can barely see them here. There's a lot of potential for restoring wetlands in this area, and that would have a huge impact on the agricultural lands that this company depends on. So, so this is the kind of story we're developing at the moment. And this model then informs local stakeholder discussions to co-create a vision for the landscape. So a vision for an ecologically and socially resilient landscape, but it's very important, as people will keep on repeating and repeating, but we have to repeat, it is very important to include the local communities from the design stage of this. And these models are top-down approaches, so they're just here to inform discussions. They're not here to prescribe decision-making on we need to restore this watershed or that area. Then this needs to be decided with the local stakeholders, the NGOs that work on the landscape, the local communities, the farmers, and governments that are implementing all this. But they're also used to communicate internally to set evidence-based targets in line with consortiums such as the Science Based Targets Network, TNFD, TCFD, as we were talking about before. And that provides evidence-based targets that are ambitious but achievable by the company. And this, so that requires a lot of internal discussion, as I'm sure you all can imagine. And then the model helps us identify which are the priority areas for scaling up nature-based solutions. I'll stop there because I know we have too much to cover, as always.
That's great. Thank you so much. We've actually come to the end, sadly come to the end of the webinar, and it just goes to show that we are covering a great deal in this foundation course, and it is absolutely impossible to do it justice in a 1 hour webinar. But we know also that many of you don't have much time, so I hope you've enjoyed tuning in. We will, as well as taking much deeper dive on the issues we briefly explored today, during the course we will certainly be tackling many of the questions you have raised raised ahead of the meeting and also during the event around finance, around permanence, additionality, Article 6. There were questions about oceans. There were some really important questions there about offsetting too. We tried to answer some of them as we went along, but there were many outstanding ones. But we will fold this in to the course. So thank you so much for contributing your ideas, your expertise and your insights. And we hope that some of you have time and capacity to join the course. We're nearly full for the September one, but we are still, there are still 1 or 2 places on that. And we also have places still available on January. So if you were able to join us, you could learn a lot more about some of the things we've not had much time for today. But thank you all very much to the panelists, to my wonderful, wonderful colleagues for wonderful presentations. And thank you all for your time and your engagement today, and to the Smith School for all their hard work in helping us prepare this course. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.